shortly.
Good morning to the Industry and Regulators Committee inquiry into UK regulators, and I'm delighted to welcome our witness today, John Penrose, who's the MP for Weston-super-Mare, and who was the author of an independent review of competition policy which touched heavily on regulations, which is obviously the subject that we want to talk about today. So John, perhaps I can start by asking you a rather more general question about the remits and the rules governing regulators. In your inquiry, did you come to the conclusion that those remits were unclear or clear, that they were sufficiently narrow to be followed through, or too wide, so wide as to confuse the regulator? And I think we've now, in this committee, met with and investigated 8 regulators, and I think it would be fair to summarise that there is a feeling that there are too many aspects to their remit, and quite how they prioritise and should prioritise those parts of their remit is not entirely clear, and not necessarily entirely clear from the government as to which they want. But you were very clear in your report what you thought should be front and centre in terms of regulation. So it would be very useful to hear your thoughts on that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Hollick, and thank you for inviting me here this morning. You're right. I mean, my report was slightly broader because it was talking about competition policy more generally, but obviously the economic regulators in particular are a core part of that. I should therefore just say that most of my remarks will be mainly focused around economic regulators, and I appreciate there's a whole slew of others who where I don't have quite such direct experience, so I will leave other witnesses to sort of fill in those gaps. But certainly when it comes to economic regulators, and sort of 8 of those at the moment, I think I'm probably going to agree with your opening remarks, Lord Hollick, which is that they have a variety. I mean, from CMA at one end of the spectrum, which basically has one statutory duty, which is competition for the sake of consumers, and we're about to add a bit more to that in the competition bill, which is, as of last night, winging its way towards your lordships later on. But they have, broadly speaking, one, and have had for some years, up to, at the other end of the spectrum, the Office for Rail and Road, which has, I think, knocking on 24 different duties, and many of them have secondary duties and take regards tos and thises and that's, and which sort of add to the complexity, which I think is sort of your lead-in and presumption. I think I would, broadly speaking, agree with that. And the danger with anything approaching a large number is that you end up with something which inevitably, after a certain number, requires the regulators to prioritise for themselves. And that often, therefore, means that they are being dragged, whether they like it or not, into political decisions when they make those prioritisation points. And it means also that it's almost impossible for them to deliver on everything at once, either through questions of resourcing or just because the whole breadth of all those duties just are too broad. And one of the things which I think is clearly a problem for some, as I said, not all, but some of these regulators, is that they've had scope creep over many years. I mean, many of the economic regulators have now been around for 45 years or so, and over that time they've added and gained extra responsibilities. When I was in business, I was always told that if you've got more than about 4 key performance indicators, the one thing you can be sure of is that some of them aren't key. And I would suggest to the committee that it's probably the case for statutory duties as well. So if you get more than a fairly small number, then you've got a problem. And the other point I would make is that even if you have a small number, if those duties are widely either divergent or widely separated, just because you've ended up with, in many cases, non-economic regulatory duties being bolted on the side. ORR has health and safety, for example, very important. But it does mean that, therefore, you end up with things which are a remit which is too broad, and therefore, again, inevitably, if you end up focusing on one thing because it's urgent, other important things may get disregarded to the long-term detriment. So I think I'm agreeing with your central point, but embroidering on that.
Well, one of the regulators we looked at in great detail was Ofwat, and the issue of balancing the level of investment that was needed over probably 2 decades had to be balanced against putting the level of charges to consumers. And at the end of the day, we concluded in our report that was a political decision, and therefore it was difficult for the regulator to actually make their own economic assessment decision on that. And indeed, as a result, the water rates were kept at a very low level, very good for consumers in the short term, but in the long term, there's now a very substantial backlog of investment that's needed, and that was one of the contributory factors to the problems with pollution in rivers. So, looking at that particular issue, balancing bills against investment, pull between the two and the need to balance the two, how does an independent regulator, economic regulator, juggle with that and get the right point of balance?
So that's a really good and current example of the kind of pressures that they're under. I'm completely with you. I would argue that it isn't just them being asked to make political decisions. I think that there was quite a lot of, over several decades, quite a lot of political pressure to do what exactly as you described and to prioritise short-term levels of bills over anything else. But I think that part of the job of particularly independent regulators is to be able to look ministers straight in the eye and say, that's fine, Minister, thank you for your view, but I've got a statutory duty to do X or Y, and providing the number of those duties isn't too high, and then to be able to turn around and say, I hear your short-term urgings, but actually I've got to do the following things because I've got the legal duties to do them, and I can't ignore these things as well. So to respond to to sort of link it back to your earlier question, if you've got a sufficiently clear and unambiguous and short list of priorities, then what you can then do and what you would then expect senior regulators to be able to do more effectively is to stand up when necessary and speak truth to power to senior ministers and say, actually, there's other things here which you're urging me to fall short on. And I think that it is argued quite widely that that's what happened in water. It wasn't just political decision-making was the problem, it was also that regulators were both very, very detailed in some of the analysis they were doing, which wasn't necessarily very helpful, but also a bit soft when it came to trying to hold the investors and owners of some of the water companies to account for what they were required to do. And that is something which isn't just political, that's also a question of regulatory backbone, if I can put it that way.
We're going to come to a question of governance and culture and resources during the course of this session, but I think it's fair to say of the 8 regulators we've looked at, we've yet to find one where the regulator had taken a view which was unpopular in terms of pricing for the government. So, but maybe there are some out there, but I think they're rare indeed.
I think that's a figure. I would actually add that I have seen other regulators in other ministerial jobs outside economic regulators. I have seen them have what you might call difficult conversations with ministers to say no, but that's a different conversation.
Lord Agnew.
Yes, good morning, John. I'm interested in your thoughts on the issue of governments almost abrogating responsibility for difficult political and distribution decisions by basically placing them in the hands of the regulator. And so what do you think about that? And linked to that, do you feel that regulators are able to be properly independent?
So things like water or energy are very good examples of this, where there's all sorts of distributional questions historically about whether or not you charge people the same cost for different elements of the utilities they get, depending on whether they live in rural areas at the end of a pipe or the end of a wire or not. So I'm sort of completely with you that these are inherently political decisions in many cases, not all. I would argue that if you've got the right statutory duties, back to Lord Hollick's initial question, then Parliament can legitimately hand over some of those responsibilities to economic regulators, possibly to other regulators too, but certainly to economic regulators, because there's been a political decision taken and there's a mandate which has sort of taken the political decision that's been handed to the regulator, and the regulator can then has then provided with political body armour to get on and do the job. That's a very different situation from leaving the regulator without that clear mandate, or a confused mandate, as we were talking about earlier on, and then the regulator has to make the trade-offs, and that, I think, is a very uncomfortable position for many regulators to be in. I don't think that's something which we as parliamentarians or ministers should want to put them in either, because it leads to a very difficult position. It also is, I think, economically inefficient, because the more political uncertainty you have, particularly for economic regulators, the more of an investment risk premium, political investment risk and regulatory investment risk premium that you build into the cost of capital for these industries. And there are plenty of people with serious economic experience around this table, so you don't need me to remind you that a couple of basis points increase in the cost of capital due to uncertainty created by us is worth a great deal of money for multi-million, sometimes £billion investments with a asset lifespan of 20, 30, 40 years. So it really matters. A further point, if I can, sort of adjacent to that, which is, I think that it therefore means that the idea of an arm's length, politically independent economic regulator is still fundamentally really important and really sound, I would argue, and very desirable. I am a little worried that there are a few more reach-in powers, political reach-in powers, which are being created. There's a couple, for example, in the competition bill, as I said, which is coming your way. And if that becomes too much of a habit for saying that the Secretary of State has to sign off on, for example, CMA guidance on this and that, then actually the number of points of access for lobbyists and the number of points of potential unexpected changes, and therefore political and regulatory risk, goes up. And so we therefore may be eroding that rather important and, I think, valuable central principle of, wherever you can, creating this arm's length political certainty in order to make a sensible political and regulatory environment.
So linked to that, in terms of the appointment of these senior regulatory people, do you think Parliament should have more oversight? So, for example, with the Office for Students, which we looked at a few months ago, the chairman of that is a Conservative peer who has not resigned the whip, which we felt was wrong. How do you show truth to power if you're still in the tribe and have been appointed as almost a matter of patronage?
So I should probably, it's a historic point, but I should probably declare a sort of historic interest, because my wife was involved with in a senior position in health regulators, and I don't think resigned the whip at that point. There was some discussion of it. So I'm probably a bit biased to answer that question clearly, and I probably should recuse myself, if you don't mind.
Well, no, I'd be interested to hear your defence. I mean, I'm genuinely... I mean, not of your wife, but of the situation that allowed this to happen.
I'm long since given up trying to either certainly speak up on behalf of my wife one way or another. It's usually a very dangerous place to be. I think that there is a point, absolutely, about Parliament taking a view on the suitability of senior appointments, not just in regulators but elsewhere too. I think that it's hard to balance that where these positions are then going to be politically at arm's length, and I think that it's hard for Parliament to balance that. because therefore Parliament needs to behave in quite a non-tribal way. It may be something which actually your lordships are better at than the Commons, because it means that you have to put aside the sort of the day-to-day cut and thrust of party politics in order to find, to make a completely disinterestedly meritocratic decision. That's probably all I can say at this point without straying dangerously off the point I was trying to make about recusing.
Thank you very much.
Clement Rhodes.
Morning, John. I've got two questions. The first is quite a general one, but I think it would be very useful to have your perspective. Are the roles and remits of regulators sufficiently discrete, or is there overlap and duplication in their responsibilities? And what is the impact of this on their performance?
So on economic regulators, there's huge overlap in principle. There's most of the competition powers, for example, which are held by Ofgem, Ofwat, Ofcom, etc., are also held by the CMA. So there's concurrency is the term they always use to describe it. Those problems are reasonably effectively, I mean, they avoid trampling on each other's toes or parking their tanks on each other's lawns, choose your metaphor, with a series of just exchanges of memorandums of understanding between them. And that, in my experience, seems to work reasonably well. They often have views about whether or not each other are exercising their powers in their particular patches well or badly, but they don't sort of tend to migrate, and they manage to stay in lane. And there's also a thing called the UK Regulatory Network, I think, UKRN, which I'm sure many of you come across, where the senior representatives from economic regulators get together to sort of compare and contrast their approaches and try and, where necessary, come up with exchange best practice, if I can put it that way. And that seems to be something which I've never been to their meetings, I hasten to add, I'm not invited, but it wouldn't be right for them, or they wouldn't feel right with a politician in the room, I'm sure. But they seem to feel that is valuable for them, and it's something which I think they find useful. So I think that's quite helpful. I think, incidentally, and sort of in parenthesis, that the difficulty which we have with individual sector regulators is that the risk of capture is a little bit higher than it is for a cross-sector regulator like the CMA. And so there's I don't know if you're going to come on to that later, so I won't sort of stray onto it now, but that is more of an issue to do with concurrency, I think, rather than parking tanks on lawn.
Yes, I'm with you. Interesting you say that actually, I mean, because you've answered my second question, which was going to be about cooperation between regulators, and of course you could also have quoted the DRCF and things like that. But I mean, we've just done a report on the water industry, and I'm quite interested in the fact that by and large you think that this overlap actually is not too much of an issue. Whereas you could describe that as a pretty good example of where the duties, by not being that clear, have caused real issues in that industry.
Can you give me an example of the sort of thing you're thinking about where the duties weren't clear and caused a problem, so I make sure I'm responding to you properly?
The Environment Agency, Ofwat, various other agencies who have duties in respect of water and sewage and so on.
I'm probably the wrong person to ask. I'll have to push that with other witnesses about the overlap between economic regulators and non-economic ones. I'm certainly aware that people do complain about it vociferously and loudly. So I'm sure there is an issue there. I'm afraid I'm not the right person to ask you about answer the detail.
Fair enough. Let me take another example in that case. I mean, the turf war sometimes between the CMA and other regulators with a competition duty like Ofcom, for instance. You think that works in a reasonably coherent way as well?
Yes. I mean, I think I have my criticism of some of the sector regulators would not be that tanks are being parked on lawns and they're tripping over each other. My criticism would be that sometimes being a sector regulator means that you're more at risk of being captured by the people you're regulating, and that therefore they've been too soft on it. Some of them have been too soft at some points in their history. But that's answering a slightly different question than the one you're asking. So I will hold fire on that until we get to that if you wish to.
And of course there is a value judgment as to whether tanks on lawns is a good thing or a bad thing. Yeah.
I think there's one example that has happened in our hearings. We looked into the LDI pension crisis, and there were three regulators: the pension regulator, the FCA, and the Prudential Regulation Authority, and all three of them missed the devastating impact of leverage.
And I think if you look at some other, this tends to come up more often in highly innovative, fast-moving sectors. So it's potentially a difficulty in telecoms where the pace of technology is changing quite fast. But certainly in finance, yes, absolutely, people are endlessly creative, and new instruments and new products are being created all the time, and so there are regular conversations. And I'm not quite sure that there is a rapid enough response to the conclusions of regulators saying, well, look, we have our powers, we have our legal frameworks, our foundational legal powers. They do not equip us to regulate that new product over there, be it crypto or something. And so we can't do it legally. We haven't, it's ultra vires for us. And then some of the other ones, so they say, go and try the adjacent regulator over here, and the adjacent regulator over here says, no, it's not us either, and then you end up with something in between. I would argue that's a problem for this building and ministers rather than the regulator. And they'll get sued pretty fast if they try and do stuff which is beyond their legal foundations.
Thank you. Baroness Taylor.
Can we develop that theme about Parliament and accountability, and indeed government and accountability and the regulators? You've seen things as a minister, you've seen things as a parliamentarian, and we've got regulators who have to have a very high degree of independence and backbone, as you actually said, which I think is a very good way of putting it, and yet somebody has to hold them to account. You've talked about ministers having priorities that perhaps meant off what went soft on pricing, and therefore the investment wasn't there. Should we have a system for ministers where there's greater clarity in any direction that ministers want to give to a regulator, so that it's not the regulator getting the mood of the moment from ministers, but actually getting some clarity about who is making the decision? And in terms of Parliament, we get the situation where Parliament every so often looks at this regulator or that regulator, but there isn't a consistent oversight there. Could you comment on whether you think we need that?
So yes, you've asked two related questions. Let's start with the ministerial one and then move on to the parliamentary one, if you're comfortable with that. So in ministerial terms, there is already a mechanism, certainly for economic regulators, I don't know about others, where there's, by convention, I think, rather than anything else, there's a sort of once a parliament strategic direction. In my experience, that is not always used, and when it is used, it tends to be a sort of densely worded, largely impenetrable 4-page letter, sometimes even a 10-page letter, and it sits on top of the statutory duties which we were talking about earlier on. And you're right. I mean, the danger of any political reach-in, which we've talked about, the dangers of the economic downsides of that, is that it tends to be driven by short-term urgency rather than long-term importance. And so that is always a danger. I agree, and I just think that the political direction, the strategic direction, mechanism is at least a way of trying to formalise that and making it A, less frequent, and B, more black and white and transparent. So that's good. But I just worry that if we sort of start to expand on that very much, then the dangers of more reach-in or more points of pressure, which regulators, supposedly independent regulators, will then have to have stronger backbones in order to resist. Exactly. So we need to be really careful about controlling that mechanism. There are plenty of unofficial, informal ways which ministers can exert pressure anyway. I don't think we need to create any more. On the point about parliamentary parliamentary responsibility and parliamentary accountability. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm afraid that, with the honourable exception of those here present, this is a politically unsexy, rather nerdy area. I mean, it's really important, I would argue. It's something which doesn't get nearly enough attention, but it is not something which gets enough focus, certainly at my end of the building. And as a result, I don't think that we're terribly good as a breed at taking account of what happens. The number of Commons Select Committee sessions on the regulators in each department's purview is pretty small. They're pretty infrequent. They tend to be relatively cursory, and they tend not to be done in any huge detail. So I'm not sure I know what the right answer is for strengthening that, but I'm pretty sure that what we've got at the moment ain't working terribly well.
So do you think that select committees should have more of a specific responsibility in terms of actually having to look at the remit, look at how it's being, doing an annual report, something of that kind?
So, I've been on a select committee or two as well, but your lordships will take your own measure of this as well. My instinct is that select committees need a reason to focus on a particular, because an entire department is a big thing. I appreciate this is a sort of cross-departmental committee with a slightly different remit. But my experience is that they need something to get their teeth into: a report, a piece of data, a target hit or missed, regularly reported on, reliably evidenced, and they need a moment of theatre in order to focus attention. And so, a target or whatever hit or missed is a good example of that. I think that that's probably the thing that we don't have enough of in this area, and we probably need to do some quite detailed thinking about how to create those mechanisms in order to get people to turn up for sessions like this properly. You guys are I'm afraid an exception rather than the rule, and I wish that there were more like this.
Yeah, but I mean, the problem is that if it's a crisis, it's probably too late. It's something that has to be done urgently, and that's where the sexy issue that you refer to comes into. So that's why I'm wondering if we could build into the responsibility of select committees some aspect of supervision, holding to account the regulators in any area. But I accept what you're saying, that it's difficult. And
I think that the chairs of the relevant departmental select committees, certainly in the Commons, would argue they already have that responsibility. I think that probably our task is to make that more, to create those moments of theatre which makes them more likely to want to do it, perhaps on a regular basis, because there's something important coming out. At the moment, the only one that really does that sort of automatically is something like the Public Accounts Committee or something like that.
Which we're going to hear from shortly.
Yeah. Lord Gilbert.
I'm just thinking about, as we move to really principle-based regulation across most of the regulators, my experience is in digital regulation. I've previously chaired the select committee here that looked at digital regulation. Does Parliament have a role in understanding how regulators are applying those principles? They're creating effectively tertiary legislation, which is a really powerful thing, that a responsibility that they have. Previously, a lot of this would have been done by Parliament in a different sort of way, but the very fast-moving digital world means that it is the only way to create regulation. Is it legitimate, do you think, for Parliament to try and have an understanding of how those principles are being applied? And then the second thought is that you talked about the cooperation between regulators. Parliament doesn't really scrutinise the cooperation. It scrutinises the individual regulators. It doesn't scrutinise how they're working together. So the Digital Regulatory Cooperation Forum, for example, brings together, I think, 5 or 6 regulators in the digital space. They share practices, they share best practice, they share information, but actually increasingly they work together. And that is beyond any scrutiny. The individual regulators are scrutinised, but not the working together. Is that an area where select committees ought to be looking?
That's actually I think, a really important point, because certainly in the Commons with departmental select committees, it is entirely possible for a select committee to be able to look at the way 3 regulators have addressed digital issues, for example, if they all come under DCMS's remit, for example, or DCIT, or whatever it might be, whichever the relevant department is. If, on the other hand, they're scattered across 3 different departments, then you'll have to have a grown-up conversation between the 3 select committee chairs, which does happen, and you end up with joint committees being formed in order to do that sort of stuff. But I think it's less likely in this area for the reasons I was just explaining in my earlier response, because we don't have the moments of theatre which gets the select committees to focus in the first place. If you did do that, in my experience, select committees are perfectly capable of forming joint or subcommittees or whatever it might be in order to deal with it. But I take your point that cooperation is very important and absolutely shouldn't be ignored. On your first point about is it legitimate for Parliament to take an interest in sort of tertiary level interpretations and creations, yes, absolutely, it's totally legitimate for Parliament to do that. I think we, though, need to be a bit careful. The closest, it's not a perfect analogy, but I think the sort of closest analogy would be in common law decisions by courts and stuff like that. I mean, ultimately, if Parliament doesn't agree with a court decision on X and Y, it isn't up to Parliament, it shouldn't be up to Parliament to criticise the decisions of the judges. It should be for Parliament to say, well, we don't like where that has reached, and we will therefore pass a statute in order to change it. And so that is, I think, the sort of a parallel which is instructive for looking at what the individual regulators are doing here. And it allows that political arm's length reducing of political interference risk to take place responsibly, but nonetheless doesn't just write a blank cheque and say, fire and forget, we won't look at this for another century, because that clearly wouldn't be responsible.
Ernest McGregor Smith.
Just on transparency with regulators and their own performance, and it's quite interesting, isn't it, if you're a regulator and you've got to decide how good your performance has been over a year and how you report on that. My first question is really about the sort of key metrics that you think should be used to determine and evaluate a regulator's performance. But secondly, I'm very taken by some of the evidence we heard on water in particular, where over a significant period of time, companies were allowed to really gear up and leverage up, and nothing was done about that. But if actually all those companies had been in, say, the public market, one of them is, but most of them aren't, there would have been more of a self-regulatory view around leverage, because the markets would have controlled that more. But here there was a real gap with a regulator that, and I'm not sure, either didn't get involved, or if they did, significant levels of leverage still happen, which has really hurt the water companies now. So I'm sort of interested in your views about the key metrics that should be used to really evaluate performance, particularly with what we've seen in water.
Yeah. Let me start at the end of your point about market valuations and that sort of stuff, because you are absolutely right to point out that there aren't many of those. There aren't many data points in, for example, water, and I think it's difficult to argue that the few there are create terribly good. It's hard to read across from there to any of the other organisations in that sector, let alone into energy or something like that as well. And one of the things that has happened, I think, over the last 40 years, if you're being slightly tongue-in-cheek, ever since people invented spreadsheets and allowed people to start modelling things in more detail, is that particularly the regulators that have to do price setting for the network monopoly piece, at least of what they're running, that modelling exercise has become ever more baroque, ever more complicated, ever more detailed, and ever more expensive and slow. And not noticeably any better in its outcomes. In fact, you just gave a really good example about why many people are highly critical of some of those outcomes after the fact, at least. So I think we've got a really big problem there, and I think that probably it means that there needs to be a fundamental rethink about how most of those regulators, run by well-intentioned, clever public service people with all the right motivations, But they've ended up in this place where they are trying to do something which is probably impossible, to model more and more of a very complicated industry, in order to fill in gaps which actually, if we can get back to something which says nobody's that clever and there's a market-based answer, there's an auction-based answer, there's a something else which will get rid of the battle of the spreadsheets in as many parts of their operation as possible. And actually, if you talk to historians in this area, they'll say that some of the original economic regulators right back in the 1980s when these things were first started, that's the way they envisaged working, and we've moved a very, very long way away from that instinct. If you can do that, you can strip out a vast amount of delay, a vast amount of cost, and a vast amount of regulatory jeopardy, because no one's that clever and therefore they get things wrong, and you end up with the questions which you were entirely legitimately asking and many others have asked as well. But I think it will take a really fundamental rethink, and it's probably one of the things which doesn't just apply to Ofwat, it applies to others, and Ofgem may be part of that as well. So, and there's an interesting comparison actually between those that have to do that and some of the other economic regulators, the CAA, for example, in air traffic control and those sort of things, has sort of managed to marketize and reduce the amount of spreadsheetable areas in their areas of authority very dramatically indeed. And while they aren't immune from criticism, there's much less scope for honest but very, very serious errors being made which come home expensively to haunt us later. So that's a sort of a long answer to your first part of your question. Your second point about what we should be measuring, therefore. I would argue more market stuff, which therefore gives you auction-based outcomes or whatever it might be. I think that though there are some things that we should nonetheless look at, actually the CMA does quite a good, I'm quite impressed by, they do an annual analysis, I think, of direct economic benefits and costs of what they do. Now, the question about whether or not that's marking their own homework and how independent that can be and whether or not someone else should be sort of checking it over, etc., etc. But the principle behind it, I think, is pretty good, because you want to bear down on the regulatory burdens being created by these organisations, particularly those with ex-ante powers, which is all of the economic ones, which we have not been good at in the past at all. But you also need to accept that those regulations can be doing something very valuable and important for a modern economy. So you don't want to have no regulation, but you do want to make sure that when you produce that regulation, the benefits wildly outweigh the costs. And so if you can do that and say, you could envisage somebody saying, we're going to publish that each year, independently audited or analysed, and we're looking for a minimum ratio of 5-to-1 or something like that. You could see why that would create some really useful pressures on regulators, and it would also, if you manage to get 5-to-1 every year, for example, that's just a number I pull out of the air rather than something based on detailed analysis, you can see why that would drive up the productivity of those sectors progressively and steadily year on year over time as well. So that would be my sort of a starting point to look at, put it that way.
Account transfers.
Could we go on to the sort of human side of regulators? You've referred to possible lack of backbone, Ofwat being a bit soft. That comes down to the people and perhaps to a lesser extent the resources. From your experience, what's your impression of the culture and the resources that regulators have had?
So as I said earlier on, almost without exception, I think every regulator I've ever met has been clever and well-intentioned and motivated by public service ethos and all those things, exactly what you'd want, and they're, many of them very impressive as well. So I don't think that regulatory capture is something that happens by design at all. The Penrose shorthand is that at any one time, roughly 1.5 of the economic regulators is captured at any one point, because it's just never the same 1.5. And it depends on when you've had a new chairman and when you've had a new chief exec and all those things. But so it's not fair to say that any one of them, Ofwat or whoever, has sort of been supine throughout. Actually, they go through cycles. Is the point, and their activities go through cycles. So if you've got a 5-year price setting review, then there's a 5-year cycle to that important piece of work, and the pressures go up and down during it as well. So it's the dangers, I think, are twofold. One is that because you get cycles of work, you get people who arrive at a particular point in the cycle, they sort of do the hard yards up whenever the difficult bit of the price setting piece is. They then have learnt a vast amount about the water industry, the energy industry, whichever regulator they were at, and they then become incredibly valuable to the firms that they were previously regulating. So their market value is enormous outside. But also, from a career development point of view, relatively speaking, it's going to be much less interesting for the next couple of years until the next cycle comes up, and that might be 5 years from hence. So it's hard, and I think many senior regulators would argue it's hard to hang on to your best staff, not because they're necessarily good or bad employers, but just because of that cyclical thing. And therefore, and it's easier incidentally for a cross-sector regulator because those cycles won't match up, and therefore you can move people around. And you also therefore get better comparisons. You can say, well, look, we didn't accept that argument when Macquarie made it for water. Why on earth should we accept this the similar argument when a different investor makes it in energy? And I was there, and here's how we argued it, and surely so you get much better sort of collective wiring and in-depth understanding about that if you are able to move people around. That's much harder in a single sector regulator for that reason. I don't see. I have not yet identified. I haven't heard many other people say that, for example, being funded by the firms that you are regulating creates any impossible problems. That doesn't seem to be something which most people feel is, it creates that much of an issue, because it's still, the funding is a mandatory thing rather than anything else. So you don't have to sort of spend time lunching your benefactors or anything like that. So I don't think that has. If it is, it's so subtle that no one's ever mentioned it to me. Put it that way. But having not worked at a regulator myself, I wouldn't have observed it. So I think that is a perfectly respectable way of doing it. But I think, again, going back to the earlier question about what are the right things to measure, you'd want to try and put more pressure on regulators to simplify what they're doing in order to reduce their costs. But that's a sort of slightly separate question.
You focused rather on the gamekeeper turning poacher. There's also obviously the issue of poachers turning gamekeeper, and what the balance of desirability is of industry, hands-on industry knowledge within the regulator, but without encouraging regulatory capture. I don't know whether, there are, in different sectors, I guess there are different traditions of the extent of that interchange.
This is rather equivalent to sort of the debate we have regularly about ministers adhering to ACABA rules about moving into and out of government, and senior civil servants as well. I think probably the same arguments apply here too, which is, if it's properly managed, there can be real value in having somebody who knows where all the bodies are buried in the industry coming into the regulator, or vice versa. But the potential for conflicts of interest is also real, and therefore it needs to be managed properly. So I think it is something which is not automatically bad, and there is potentially real good in it, but it does have to be managed very, very carefully, and checking that those conflict of interest management processes, it is a question of if there's a conflict of interest. There's often conflicts of interest. It's a question of what you do when you find one in order to manage it properly. That needs to be dealt with, but I don't think we should be assuming that it's something which is automatically bad and we should always try to stop.
In terms of speaking truth to power, I think you said that from your ministerial experience there were regulators who were were quite ready to do that. I don't know whether by inference that suggests that looking from the outside, you think that the regulators you've looked at have not really had that as an endemic part of their culture.
I can't speak to. I haven't been in the room for the private conversations between the people who run the economic regulators today and the relevant secretaries of state. So I don't know what tone and tenor those have. I would observe, though, that for those industries which are in trouble in terms of the value which we all think they're providing to their customers, and to the extent that by popular conclusion, some of that is caused by poor regulatory decisions over quite a long period of time in some cases in the past. I would imagine that if I was a senior regulator running one of those organisations, I'd feel like I was on the back foot when I walked in the door. But I don't know whether or not that creates a difficulty for them when they get through the door, because I haven't been in the room.
I mean, from our recent inquiry into the OFS, I think we all came away concerned that the OFS was not looking very far, or at least in its conversations with the sponsoring department, were not looking very much into the future in terms of the financial sustainability of the sector.
Not an area I focused on, I'm afraid, so I will have to cede to your superior knowledge of that one.
One of our witnesses, in fact a number of them, raised the question of rising stars in the civil service being put in a position where clearly they're looking for further preferment, and therefore that would somewhat compromise their attitude and the, use your word, backbone. Do you think there is a danger that in fact that does cause a problem?
So I think there's a fundamentally different point, a fundamentally different purpose of being an arm's length regulator and a Whitehall civil servant. The job description ought to be different, I would argue, because a civil servant is supposed to do their best for the government of the day. The head of an economic regulator certainly is not supposed to do their best for the government of the day. They're supposed to fulfil their statutory duties on the presumption those statutory duties have been put together properly, as we started with. So I think that requires a different attitude, and you would require a high-quality person to have clocked that it's a different attitude and to have drunk deeply from the new well before they took up the new role, I would say.
Thank you. Well, Ray.
Good morning. Do you believe that regulators engage sufficiently with consumers? And how does this compare with regulators' engagement with businesses? And what impact does this have on regulatory decision-making?
So lots of regulators, and certainly the economic regulators, have the Consumer Council for X and Y. And those bodies can be, if they're well run, can be really helpful. They can make sure that you are not ignoring marginalised consumers, and that there's proper access, and that people who are vulnerable are not being forgotten, all those sorts of things. So they can do a really valuable role. I guess that the bit which would worry me a bit, though, is not that. It is that in listening to those bodies, and they make important points, the danger is that an economic regulator may actually forget that their main job ought to be, in my view at least, competition for the benefit of consumers, and actually their job is therefore not to try and work out what consumers want and order companies to do it. Their job is to empower consumers, so consumers through their choices and market decisions can give that information directly to the companies concerned rather than mediated via the regulator. And I think that's part of the problem, which goes back to the point about the battle of the spreadsheets and trying to model ever more and more and more about what goes on in an industry, which is fundamentally an impossible task and self-defeating. So yes, they usually make many of them make great efforts, but there's a limit to what those things can do when actually, if the best thing you can do is to get out of the way and empower the consumers and let the consumers talk directly to the firms you're regulating, that may be a better way of doing it.
And your report suggested, for instance, that the CMA could do a better job.
So I think there's some more fundamental questions about what is fair for consumers, if that's what you're driving at. So there's, I think the difficulty with society's conception of what is fair and what is therefore doing the right thing by your customers is that society isn't a static thing, thank goodness. Society's opinions move, and therefore you can be doing something which is perfectly reasonable today, and then there's some sort of social or political convulsion, and all of a sudden you are on the front page of the tabloids for being a beast and doing something awful tomorrow. And so I think it helps. I think it would help if CMA did a bit more to try and work out what fairness looks like in advance. It's not possible to do this precisely or permanently, but to this point about, I think Lord Gilbert, you were making the point about tertiary legislation. If you can come up with something which is an intuitive rule which tells you roughly where fairness ought to be in advance, if you're a businessman or woman, a business leader, then the chances are that it would be very, very valuable to be able to say, well, here's the heuristic decision-making mechanism which will allow me to get it right probably without having to reach for a lawyer every single time or run the risk of getting stamped on by a regulator. I was suggesting in my report that there's something called transactional fairness, which has been come up with by a bunch of academics. That may be the right version or may not be, but having something which is a sort of a rule of thumb, which will allow business leaders who are risk averse and don't want to try and find the bleeding edge of where the regulators are, and say, if I'm doing something which is roughly in line with these 2 or 3 principles, I'm probably safe most of the time. That could actually be very, very valuable indeed, and might be something which CMA or others could usefully do for the productivity of Great Britain PLC.
You made a number of recommendations in your report. What was the response to your recommendations on competition policy? And do you feel that the regulators have listened to and implemented your recommendations?
It depends on my mood on the day you ask me that question, but if it's a glass half full or a glass half empty day. I actually did an 18-month update called Unfinished Revolution after my initial Government Commission report, which sort of had a scorecard on it, and since then things have moved on. I think the glass is more than half full now. So the competition bill is doing an awful lot of the things which I was suggesting in Power to the People, this thing, the Government Commission report. And the data bill is also doing a collection of things about smart data, which I think are incredibly important and are also part of my recommendations too. And the procurement bill has also done a collection of things which are important as well. So broadly speaking, the answer is yes. However, there are still some omissions. We had a conversation and a debate yesterday in the Commons about better regulation and regulatory burdens, and I'm pleased to tell you all that we've got some commitments from the Minister at the dispatch box about trying to do more in that area, which I'm going to be forming a little group of ankle biters to sort of make sure that those are delivered on. So I think that's an area where we are still underplaying it. I worry that our recently passed rules about government subsidies, we put through some legislation about that about a year ago now, I think it must be, might leave a bit too much play for political interference, but we'll see about that. History will show us, and a bit of post legislative review will allow us to gauge if my fears are legit or whether or not I'm being overly worried. So broadly speaking, I think quite a lot of progress in quite a lot of important areas. The bit where I think we still have problems is in this area of economic regulators and their statutory duties, and getting them to focus more closely on competition for the benefit of consumers. I think that is something which is still unfixed, and that would be my major area, I think, now. Although if you'd asked me before yesterday's debate, I'd have added in better regulation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Can we focus a little bit more on this competition as an objective for regulators, because opinion seems to fall into two different camps on this very much. I get totally the interest in competition on behalf of consumers, locally, if you will. But what about the international competition side of it? Because there is an element of our regulators are too strict, and we're going to, there's a race to the bottom if we let slip. So there's two counter arguments. One is that our USP as UK PLC, forgive all the acronyms, is that we are quite a cautious regulatory environment, and that's not such a bad kite mark to have, and you risk throwing that away if you make international competition an objective of the regulator. And secondarily, competition is sort of linking through to economic growth, and that's a responsibility of the government economic policy of the day. It isn't the job of regulators. So how do you feel about the international competition aspect of regulators' objectives?
So I'm afraid I don't have much truck with the underlying assumption of that argument, I guess, because I don't think that there is an either-or choice between domestic competition and international competitiveness, if I can put it that way. In fact, I would argue quite the reverse. The more competitive the UK economy is in every single sector, the tougher the competition it is here, then the more likely it is that our companies based and operating here are going to be successful in export markets. You know, the phrase "you can make it here, you can make it anywhere" applies in spades in this area. And so I think just the dichotomy, which I appreciate you weren't necessarily espousing it, but you were sort of explaining it. I think it's just fundamentally a misconceived starting point for that. And therefore what it means as well is that we should be aiming to have the most competitive markets on the planet, ideally, in every single sector of our economy, because it equips us to be more effective internationally and successful in export markets. What it doesn't mean is that, therefore, you should have capricious regulators. You know, your point about caution is something which we can have at the same time, and I think we should argue we should have at the same time. It should be cautious, evidence-based, steady, predictable steps towards the toughest competition you can have. And those two things aren't or shouldn't be in conflict with each other.
But you'll appreciate that the culture of many a regulator will be towards caution rather than adventure. And are you not heading in the direction of having regard to competition rather than it being a core objective?
I'm not sure I understand your question. I think I'm arguing that caution is you need to be evidence-based and predictable in the direction you're taking, but that you are utterly ruthless about the fact that the direction you're taking is in favour of ever stronger competition and ever tougher competition. Have I misunderstood your question there, or is that?
Let's take a sort of structure. Let us suppose regulation in country X, which is economically very successful, is less cautious than ours. Should we be copying them or holding to our USP of being more cautious?
So I think it depends on why country X is successful. I mean, to your point about economic growth is the responsibility of government rather than just of regulators. I think that it is entirely legitimate for us to say economic growth for the benefit of consumers is a really good central principle for not just the CMA, but I would argue for many other economic regulators, because competition is only one part of economic growth. It's an important part, but also we've given responsibility for interest rates on a political mandate with a statutory duty, as we were talking about earlier, to the Bank of England on the same basis. So it's entirely reasonable for governments to give discrete bits in a black box to a regulator to manage this piece properly with some very, very strong guidelines and duties and accountability. And this is another example of that, I would argue. But that doesn't mean to say that therefore governments abrogating all its responsibilities. There's still a heck of a lot more about economic growth than just competition policy, or just competition regulation, or just interest rates. and there's a whole range of other things, skills and all the other things which I'm sure everybody here is comfortable with, which matter too. So I think that it's, again, I think it's probably a false choice, and we can and should have both.
Thank you very much.
Well, Chandos, you had a quick follow-up.
Are there, is competition always the best way of protecting consumer interests? I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, of the approach taken to Premier League football rights. For the consumer, it seems to push the price up of being able to watch as many matches as possible. It may have benefited the clubs, but has it benefited the consumer? So that's why I said competition for the benefit of consumers, and that's the second half of the CMA's sort of statutory duty, and it really matters because you can have competition which benefits producers or monopolists, or so you need to make sure that you're trying to capture consumer surplus. You're trying to create and capture consumer surplus in order to make sure that this is something which works in a modern liberal capitalist democracy. Otherwise, you very rapidly lose consumer consent and willingness to go along with it. I'm not familiar enough, I'm afraid, with the football industry to know which bits of that might mean that fans got a better deal. So I will leave that to football experts. But I think that one of the things which has made me most reassured about the competition bill, as I said, coming to you guys in a minute, is that it has built into it some very important clauses which says, look, you can come up with ex ante conduct regulations on this or that for whichever sector you want to do it for. It might be football, might be anything else. But ultimately, we want you please to look at pro-competitive interventions rather than just conduct regulations. And that strikes me as a really vital piece of discipline for any economic regulators to have, because otherwise you end up with more and more conduct regulations and more regulatory burdens, as we were talking about earlier on, and you don't do the underlying reforms which may actually solve the problems at birth, prevention being better than cure.
John, thank you very much indeed. It's been a very helpful session, and we are seeing the CMA next week, so we'll look forward to their the session with them, which you're putting very much as front and centre in part of regulatory policy. It'll be interesting to see how comfortable they are putting place in that position. And certainly Andrew Tyree, who gave us some testimony a few weeks ago, expressed some fairly serious reservations about their performance. So yes. We'll look forward to next week. But thank you very much indeed for hearing from you, and close the session. Thank you.
You all for your time.
Thank you.